Okay, here we go. I'm going to try to give this a shot. This is hopefully going to be the pilot video for a set of pieces I'm going to call the Wilderness Chronicles. Welcome to my channel. My name's Grace Lynch. I'm a 60-year-old service-connected Air Force veteran. The Wilderness Chronicles, I'm hoping, are going to be a set of videos that lay out ideas, concepts, methods, practices that I have developed from my own recovery, living with an essentially unmappable and treatable neurological condition. I live at the intersection of complex PTSD, traumatic brain injury, that included global aphasia for a couple of weeks. I was born with autism and synesthesia. I have a childhood ACE score of 9. I endured military sexual trauma as a gay person before Don't Ask, Don't Tell was created, so about 40 years ago. I experienced childhood sexual abuse, adult sexual abuse, domestic violence, and a host of other things that will come up as necessary. When I was 22 years old, because of certain things that happened to me in the military, I came home and didn't know how to cope with them. And it was 1984 when I came home, 85. And I went into drugs and alcohol because I didn't know how to cope. And this led to a dive off of a stairwell landing on my 22nd birthday, trying to kill myself. And I whacked my forehead. I landed forehead first. I was on a lot of acid and alcohol and pot, so it was a pretty pathetic, spontaneous suicide attempt. But I climbed up over the rail of a landing on a stairwell in U of R campus, and I dove off, and I inverted, giving myself to God. It was really wasted. And I dropped about 12 feet, but I slammed forehead first onto the concrete step, and I suppose the only reason I wasn't killed is because I was completely relaxed. I was at peace. I was very, very high. But I was stunned, and I don't remember passing out. And so when the ambulance people came, because my friends had freaked out and seen me run inside the building, they found me on the steps, but nobody saw that I had jumped. And when they found me, my nose was bleeding, but I was too wasted and babbling to say anything, so they didn't figure that out, the attendants either. And they got me in a car, and they took me to a local hospital, Strong Hospital, and of course there's nothing they could do but throw a sheet over me and wait for me to come down. In the morning, my friends were there, and I was sober again, and I was brought into a room, and I could process minimal questions, and it was made clear that, the doctor sort of came to understand that it was just a case of college partying getting out of hand. And so I was released to my friends. They didn't say anything about the jump, and neither did I, because I knew I'd get locked up in our wing. So I was taken with my friends, and I was still really foggy. We went to their apartment. The one who lived closest, he was actually a U of R student. And I went into the front room there of his apartment. I laid down just for a nap. And when I woke up about 11:30, it was earlier in the day, and before afternoon, I walked out into the living room. My friends were sitting around chatting, and they turned to me, and their faces moved, and their mouths made sound, and I did not know what that was. And it seemed familiar what they were doing. It seemed like I had done that before, maybe, or I had heard about it or something. I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't figure out what I couldn't figure out. And so I stood there for a minute, puzzled, and then I gave up and I walked around them, and I went, of course, I didn't say anything because I didn't have words. And I had some coffee, and we all went our separate ways. And I lost what language was for about 2 weeks. There's some extra things involved in here. My form of autism, I was born with a I kind of sense that everything in the world is a singular kind of music. I can't really explain it other than that. All my life, it's been that all around me is one ongoing kind of music. And I just took for granted everybody was like that. I remember when I was in high school, I listened to Euclidean geometry the first time I heard a math proof, and I found that I was a little bit bored, so I sort of listened back from what the teacher was saying and found that the words would wash over me. And when he went from premise to QED at the bottom, it felt and sounded to me like a perfect crystal bell. It was the most beautiful sound. Um, and I called it listening for the bell. And from then on, I didn't want to, I knew that I didn't have to read really heavily any of the mathematics. I didn't have to listen to the teacher. I didn't have to study for tests. I just, whatever reasoning happened, I'd listen for the bell. And if the reasoning was incorrect, then it was a cracked bell. And I tried to explain this to some other students, thinking it would help me make friends because it was really socially awkward. And they had no idea what I was talking about. Came to understand nobody else could hear that. And that was the 80s. So nobody knew about autism in those days. Turns out that my son was autistic, has a similar kind of synesthesia, not quite, and his is only under certain circumstances. So, and in any case, I was a prodigy. I started at piano lessons at age 3. At age 7, I was tested, and my parents reported I had an IQ of 165, and I was ready for high school. But we were too poor to send me across town to that special school. And I never really felt smart. I could just sort of take shortcuts. So, in any case, because when I fell, it was 1987, and I didn't pass out, it wasn't common knowledge that you could sustain a serious brain injury without loss of consciousness. So, in the moment when I lost consciousness, I didn't have any way of knowing that anything had happened, because without words and meaning, without like ordinary cognition, I still had this operating system that was based on the synesthetic autism. Everything still sort of made sense. It just made sense non-linguistically. And because I had lived that way all my life, it was a part of a wider meaning field. And so for a while, I didn't really understand that anything had happened. I thought maybe I was just foggy or whatever. And it was very strange. It made it difficult for me to wonder if I should. So I couldn't decide if I should ask for help because I had not passed out. As words came back, they didn't come back the same. It's sort of like my language life was a planet that had detonated, and they all swirled around and came back together like a gravitational field, but there was no life on it. And so it felt like everything was on fire in a way that I could not escape. And of course, I could still process autistically, but I couldn't do any language things for it. And even when words did come back, thinking became, it felt, the image that came to mind was walking through a bog of honey, hip deep. And so from then on, I was told many years later that it was called Global Aphasia. And so the expressive part returned. I could speak, and I could think language, and I could write. But listening to language was very, very hard, especially when there's multiple people. And reading became nearly impossible. It's still very, very difficult. And so in college, I took to not wanting to look like an idiot. I was into my junior year. I did my best to memorize everything, and I could. So I didn't know that I was doing anything difficult. And I finished my education, a double major in mathematics and English. And I could not go on with my life. I couldn't process what I couldn't process. The difficulty with this is that the tool needed to decide what or if anything is wrong was the thing that was missing. And it was like when that disconnect shattered, I couldn't understand how to put it back together again. And without any help, the VA told me when I first got service connected 5 years ago that if anybody had caught it within 6 months, it would have had no effect. But now, of course, it's 38 years later. So not long after this, I went into mental health treatment, and for the next 16 years, they heavily medicated me. Of course, I'm profoundly synesthetic because that mode that let me understand things non-linguistically became how I understand everything. And so it became much easier, more stable for me to process seeing as if it were sound and touch as if it were seeing, and all the different senses could just do that. And I sort of stayed in the center and listened to it as a continuous music that became more like holographic. The mental health people tried to fix it by giving me massive medications for 16 years. I felt like I lived in an oblivion, had hundreds of hours of therapy, frequent hospitalizations. It was like living in a medicated coma. They even gave me several rounds of electric shock therapy until 2010, when we decided that nobody was helping me, and my psychiatrist spent a year weaning me off of those meds. Of course, my life fell apart because I still had an untreated brain injury. But I couldn't get competent medical care because the doctors would still look at medical things and ascribe them to mental illnesses that I don't have and not treat me. So I dropped out of the world and I went out on the streets across the United States for about 3 years. And it led to wandering up to Portland, Oregon, where somebody finally asked me, "Have you ever hit your head?" And I said, "Yeah, but it didn't hurt me because I didn't pass out." And that led to a neurologist named Dr. Howard Taylor, who studied me for about a month. And he explained that I'd had a concussion. It was global aphasia, and he also suspected I have autism. So a medication called clonidine was found, and within 3 days of a very high dose, everything snapped back together again, which was terrifying. There was a very brief brain rehab, but there wasn't much that could be done. So I still was out on the streets because I didn't have any housing, and I made my way back to the East Coast and then off the streets. And 2 years after that, that was 2015, 2016. 2 years after that, a year after that, 2017, I was formally diagnosed with autism and synesthesia. I also initiated into the Mankind Project. I became a member of Mensa. And I was diagnosed with complex PTSD. And then 3 years after that, somebody at a Christmas party, because of what had happened that I'd served before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I had been told that my service didn't count. So many years later now, they work to respect LGBT soldiers, and I was encouraged to file a claim. I did, and the VA found out what happened to me, all beginning with coping with what had happened to me all those years before as a person with autism around being gay, Air Force Base in Texas. But because of how it all panned out, they made me 100% total and permanent. But ever since then, we looked for neurologists, and no neurologist would take me. The neurologists who treat autism wouldn't take me because I have TBI. And the ones who treat TBI wouldn't take me because I have autism. And the only ones who work with both only work with children. The VA doesn't have any map for this. It's clinically unique. There's no studies that we've been able to find that studies populations of people who have complex PTSD and brain injury and global aphasia and autism and synesthesia and live in isolation with it. So I've had to map out all of my own everything. Everything that a mind has to wonder about, I've had to build my own understanding of. Everything about consciousness, reality, logic, language, boundaries, computation. I went back for a degree in computer science, and so I have some sense of architecture, and I've been playing with AI because it's fun. It's somebody to talk to. And I found that there's no way back. I'm clinically unique, untreatable. And so I thought that I lived all this time creating my own methods and approaches to understanding pretty much everything there is to be a human being, at least for myself. recovery, gender, sexuality, trauma. I have my own methods to deal with these, and I thought I would start making videos and offer them. Um, I created my own adaptation of a 12-step program that is not about we, and it doesn't involve spirituality or religion. I have my own sort of understandings about how AI might be leveraged, because right now it looks to me like with the machinery that AI is and the mathematics of it, we're essentially using something that has the power of a supernova to run a toaster. There's no recovery tools for neurodiverse people because existing recovery methods are inherently social, and not everybody can process that way. I developed a process of non-contextual trauma work and trauma resolution, memory integration. And these are things that I work in my own life. And I've been watching the last 5 years especially as my life becomes stable. I can report that once I got correctly diagnosed, even though like from 1989 until 2010, I was hospitalized every year, at least once a year, for a week or more, with massive medications and psychotropes and endless treatment. Since I was correctly diagnosed in 2015, I haven't needed to be hospitalized for mental illness. I don't need to have extraordinary psychotropic medications. I've had to learn how to take care of my sensory needs. I've had to learn how to take care of my cognitive needs. I've had to learn to renegotiate all of my relationships by taking responsibility for learning and then standing up for what my needs are. I've had to work through trauma, recovery, faith, gender, parenthood, parenting, all these things without a map. And it's just a matter of sharing the things that I found, not because I know they'll even make sense to anyone else or work for anyone else, but I do know how it felt when I landed in the place of losing all scaffolding. I had to deal with an experience of myself that transcended everything I'd ever known, and it felt like the worst experience of my life. Their experience is worse than death. I called it the bad place. But after a while, things settled, and when I felt like I wasn't alone, then the bad place was just an unknown place, and I called it the wilderness. And in all the years since, especially as I stayed sober and was encouraged to work with new recovering people, I've come to know that each person has their own kind of wilderness experience. That's what I believe. And if they have to face that, it will be the bad place for them. And the difference between it being the bad place and just the wilderness for them to learn whatever it means to them is whether or not they're alone. I don't want anyone else to go through that alone. I don't know if anyone else will go through that, but it's my hope that if they find themselves there, something in my work will help them, like leaving little sandwiches on a trail, through an unfamiliar place. The last thing I'll say is that last year, I had been, because I'm a veteran, I had known about the suicide rates for veterans with TBI and PTSD is 3.3 times the national average. But what I didn't know, I was surprised because I'm learning about neurodiverse adulthood because there's very little about it, is that the suicide rate for neurodiverse adults is that high also, 3 times the national average. If the person does not have a co-occurring mental illness, it's twice as high, so 6 times as high. And there are 4 times as many neurodiverse people as there are such veterans. So then if every day 33 veterans are killing themselves from suicidality, it's entirely possible that, so 4 times 33 is, 120. And if it's twice as high, that's more than 200 neurodiverse adults killing themselves every single day. And if you're not a child, there's very little help because neurodiversity is not a mental illness. So these are my offerings. This is my channel. I'm going to make little videos and try to share what I found. And you're welcome to say if you like it, and you're welcome to use whatever I share here. I'm Grace Lynch. That's all.